Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Greg Kelly, host of Greg Kelly Reports on Newsmax, author of Justice for All, How the Left is Wrong About Law Enforcement. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Charles. Professor, great to see you. And thanks for having me.
It is great to have you. We are going to try to talk about as much as we can because you talk for a living, so you have an opinion on everything, and I'd love to hear it. I want to briefly talk about the book because you talk about the left being wrong on law enforcement, and you kind of know a thing or two. You grew up pretty close to that. So talk a bit about what you were trying to point out in the book.
Well, look, it's been going on for decades, but it really intensified in 2020. The left and their outrage about law enforcement, about police, policing in New York City. Gosh, we almost perfected it. My father was the police chief for 12 years, the commissioner. When he left office in 2014, the NYPD's approval rating was at about 70%, and his personal approval rating was at 75%. They knew how to do it, and they knew how to do it with the community's cooperation and appreciation. But I think as part of a much larger left-wing plot that has been unraveled, and this is an effort ultimately to nationalize the police. That's what the left, I think, ultimately wants. They want a much stronger federal government. And I just saw so many lies being told. I wanted to correct the record. I wanted to, quite frankly, defend my father's legacy and point out what really happened. And I also, to the extent that I could, wanted to have a conversation about race, an honest conversation about race in place of the very dishonest and I think counterproductive conversation that has dominated over the past couple of years. And I also really wanted to address January 6th. I consume a lot of mainstream media, and what has been said about January 6th, what has been done to those people who were arrested, is terribly unfair. And I wanted that insanity kind of documented. It's one thing to tweet, it's one thing to say a cable TV show, but there's something special about writing a book, and I wanted to document it. And there you have it. It was a privilege to do it. I, quite frankly, to have a publisher, a mainstream publisher, embrace me, not the message. They don't have to endorse the message, but to give a conservative a platform at a place like Threshold Books and Simon & Schuster. Incredibly grateful. So it's a little bit about where I'm coming from.
All right. I want to say something briefly about New York, and then I'll let Will get in here. One of the things that, you got to put a finer point on it, because you got to remember, everyone's not in New York, so they don't understand the improvements where New York was and where it ended up. And my wife grew up in New York, but you're in the middle of it, so you don't really see it. There was crime, but you forget about how bad it was. Clearly, they noticed the difference, both from the broken windows approach and the literally fewer lives being lost. But at its height, there were somewhere around 2,100 murders in a year at its height in New York. And when he left, I believe it was it around 300? Murders?
Yeah, it was between 300 and 400, I believe. And the 2000 figure, I think, was hit in about 1990, right. Which was a crisis year. Right. And crack was really the drug of choice, which is a stimulant more than heroin, which became the drug of choice. And but some interesting things happened in 90, 91, 92. My father, along with David Dickens, hired 5,000 new cops, which is just a gargantuan increase for a police department. That is That's just not done. And to make that happen and to aggressively deploy them as they did, crime actually started the reverse trend or dipping in 1992 in significant ways. And of course, Rudy Giuliani and his team deserve a great deal of credit. One thing about that era, though, it was, I think, more charged racially than it had to be. And one of the things that I'm really proud of my father's tenure, for about a dozen years, this was a placid city in terms of race relations. It's remarkable. It's ancient history. Nobody really remembers, but it was. And that's a pretty stark contrast to the 90s.
All right. Will, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, so I think all of us are from these giant cities. I mean, Charles, like you grew up near Chicago, moved to Chicago, then you moved to New York, right? So I mean, like
Yeah, I
we've
wanted
all
to punish
seen, yeah, you're just, I mean, you like it at the top. I mean, but like Louisville's the smallest city I've ever lived in. So I mean, we've all seen these patterns in crime, and I mean, what Greg's saying is accurate. Crime in New York, and I mean, his father's owed a fair chunk of the credit here, dropped 90%. And that's part of a general cycle in crime that we saw in the United States. So, I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but I mean, this is actually my research area to some extent. Between 1963 and 1993, I mean, crime in the USA exploded maybe 600%. Murders went from about 8,000 to about 25, 26,000. And New York City alone was responsible for 10% or so of that. I mean, murders in some years would hit 23, 2,400. And as the result of a bunch of things, broken windows policing, the breaking of the crack epidemic, so on down the line. I mean, yeah, murders sank under 300. We're now seeing them rise back to, 400, 500 perhaps a year. There's not really necessarily a question that comes out of that. To the extent there is, I guess it's why ignore success? Like what, Greg, and for that matter, Charles, like why do you think these cycles happen? Like it seems really obvious to me that there are things like investing more money in police, putting more cops on the street that reduce crime. And the pattern that we seem to see is that crime will drop to a certain extent, and then there's a backlash against policing or against whatever the technique was that reduced it. You then see crime rise again, and there are a whole bunch of very weak explanations given for why that is. Eventually, people have had enough of that. They do the obvious again. Crime sinks again. So, any thoughts on that? And I guess how long will this latest cycle of it last?
If I can, it's interesting. It's not that the people got tired of it or found stop and frisk or whatever too pervasive and they wanted a correction. The way it works in New York City, you can become mayor with basically 200,000 votes. And we have primary day in New York City is now on the last day of school. The last day of school is when people come out for the Democrat primary. Eric Adams won the primary with 200,000 votes in a city of 8 million people. Winning the primary is tantamount to winning the general election. I mean, it's just a given, especially given, well, Curtis Sliwa I love, but he did not have the credentials of a Rudy Giuliani and a Mike Bloomberg. So you just have to appeal to a very small kind of sliver, and they're driven by activists. You can basically impose whatever reality you want. Talk about it. I mean, de Blasio ran on a campaign that the police department had overdone it on stop and frisk and was out of control. But I mentioned people love the police department. It's at 75% approval. And imagine the police commissioner, the personification of the police department, the most beloved figure in state politics, if you want to call it politics. So it was a shortcut to get power, actually. And it became a parlor game. I mean, it's not about what's actually happening. It's about who you're talking to on your phone and what you want to see on your phone.
Right.
I'm talking about 7 years ago. I'm not talking about what we're seeing now and the viral videos and that kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Well,
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And just one quick comment there. I mean, that actually is very similar to what we just saw in the Chicago elections. Because I mean, as you probably know, Lori Lightfoot, I mean, the legendary, to many people, the much hated mayor of Chicago, just lost in the last election, finished third. And I think a lot of people assumed that Paul Vallis, who's kind of a moderate to conservative Democrat, the school's chief, tough on crime, would be elected mayor. And in fact, Lightfoot was replaced by someone even worse. I think, Charles, you'd probably agree on that, was replaced by Johnson, who's a left wing activist who, during a recent spate of rioting over a weekend a couple weeks ago, started saying things like, let's not demonize the rioters. You know, we all made mistakes as kids. I mean, this is interspersed with videos of people standing on burning cars and shit, excuse me. So, I mean, the question was, how did Johnson win? And the simple answer, I mean, is if you unpack the data, it's exactly what you guys were describing. The voter turnout was 18%. That wasn't all for Johnson. So, yeah, in a lot of these big cities where, I mean, most people that are going to vote at all that have the record that would allow them to vote at all are busy working. Yeah, if you can turn out your base, you can, with very few votes, win. So yeah, we saw the same thing, and to some extent that does clarify it. It's just a real pity because what's going to happen, obviously, in Chicago now is that we're going to surge over 1,000 murders per year, and then hopefully you will see enough of a backlash that, again, the obvious things that reduce crime, like more cops, longer sentences and so on, will be implemented again. But that cycle's something that in political science or criminal justice you definitely notice, and it occurs over and over and over again.
I want to take a stab at your question, but I briefly want to say about Brandon Johnson. That wasn't even the craziest thing he said. He also says, what, homework? No, I don't give homework and I don't like grades. No one will ever get an F if I'm mayor. No, when he was a teacher, he was like, I don't ever give an F. So you don't hold anybody back. You don't hold them accountable. You think you help them in the long run. That was asinine. But one of the things is something that I write about in my book, something Greg writes about, and you do in doing research, you talk about a lot. Another reason is people rewriting history. Right? So if that stuff really happened, but we can frame it differently, people are going to pay attention to the way we framed it versus the reality. You can say, for instance, that part of it was pre-social media and cell phones, but Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, right? The narrative in that book, whether it's true or not, it's not. People believed it and pushed it, and other people referenced it, and it shaped it, right? You can say, Greg writes about this. So when the crack epidemic was happening, all the people wanting to get tough on crime and fix that problem, which is the right thing to do. Charlie Rangel comes in and, he's a Democrat. He's a black man representing Harlem. And he's like, you got to do something about it. But the interesting thing about that is, so he goes to Nixon. If this is, you would think, famous, but only the people who get this really know this. He goes to Nixon's like, you better do something about this, put some people in the street. We need to lock these people up. And if you don't do anything about it, I will come out and publicly call you racist for not saving our neighborhood. Nixon's paranoid. Nixon records the conversation. It's on tape, and you never hear anyone on the left reference it. So they just slide that under the rug, say things differently. So if you can change history and you can just say, no, you write, you do the research, Will. You can say 10,000 blacks are shot every year that are unarmed by the police. So, and when Will comes back on, I'm sure he'll give that whole stat. Well, they did a research and they asked people on the left, what percentage of blacks do they think are shot by police, unarmed blacks? And depending on how far left, the further left they went, the higher the number went, right? You and I both know the numbers in somewhere around a dozen, but some people said 100. They went further left. Some people said 1,000, and the smallest group at the furthest left said 10,000. So if you believe 10,000 blacks are being shot every year by cops who are unarmed, of course you will vilify the police. Of course you will say whatever they're doing is wrong. We need to defund them. We need to abolish them. When the people who are pushing it don't believe it, but they have a separate thing that they're trying to do. But if one way to get the populace to agree with them is to paint this picture, that's what they do. What do you think about that, Greg?
Well, you're spot on, of course, and the media's role in all of this, my goodness. I mean, they're just despicable. I actually do not object to the term enemy of the people. They perform so negatively for America with no context, no perspective. It's tantamount to perpetual lying, and they've got everybody at each other's throats, and they bear so much responsibility, and I find them absolutely reprehensible as a group.
But Nixon's meeting is on tape. Why isn't everybody playing it? Why doesn't everyone know that Charlie Rangel and the Congressional Black Caucus demanded that he got the drug dealers off the street.
Number one, actually, to be honest, even though I'm familiar with the discussion and I have it in my book, I have not heard the taped version, and I love all things Nixon, and I have to find that right away. But I don't think even that. Look, that it's too nuanced. It's too who's Charlie Rangel? You know what I mean? It's what happened 8 seconds ago.
Right.
And although that is fascinating, and he was essentially the co-signer to the war on crime, the war on drugs, Charlie Rangel, who, by the way, is still alive. I loved him, a real giant in New York and in America, and they just don't make them like that anymore.
And he was saying it all the way through the 90s. He was still, when they interviewed him after the fact, he was still like, yeah, I said, that's what I said. So even if you discount the Nixon thing, he was openly saying, yeah, nobody in their right mind would think you don't lock these people up. That was the normal way that people reacted to it until later. So to say that there's some conspiracy surrounding race to cause this just makes absolutely no sense. When you dropped, I was going to tell you to give the stat of the number of people in that poll on the left who said the number of unarmed blacks that were killed every year. Remember the poll that said the further left they went, some said 1,000, some said 10,000?
Yeah. So, I mean, this actually gets into the point it sounds like you guys were just discussing, which is kind of the lack of knowledge across a whole bunch of issues, especially on the political left, that shapes these conversations. So, I mean, like the 1994 crime bill thing, that's exactly correct. One of the driving forces behind it, and it sounds like this was already covered, but was the Congressional Black Caucus, which was staying in kind of that New Jack City era. Like, we can't have these dope fiends doing this. I mean, we can't have drug dealers running areas of the city. And by the way, that's a complex bill. I mean, in Kentucky, people will tell you that the penalty for meth, which is kind of the poor white drug of choice, you may have heard, is identical to the penalty for crack. So what you have is an exception for kind of powder cocaine. And I mean, I think to some extent that's because stockbrokers doing a couple lines in the office with their girlfriend. I mean, that's not really causing a lot of violence or a lot of mayhem out on the street, whatever you might think morally about it. So, but in terms of what you were saying there, the numbers on violence against Black people, yeah, the Skeptic Research Center a couple of years ago did a poll where they asked two groups. They asked Black people and white urban liberals, which I think is to some extent an even funnier population. But how many unarmed brothers, unarmed African-American men, they believe are killed each year by the police? And the average was between 1,000 and 10,000. So it was, and Charles, you've heard these numbers too. You might correct a little bit, but it was like 35% of people thought it was about 1,000. 15% of people thought it was about 10,000. And I believe 8% of people thought it was more than that. Yeah, so the actual number of unarmed African-American men that were killed by cops this year was, I think, 11. It's since dropped to 7. So this kind of panic based on non-knowledge is something that you really see very often when you talk to a certain kind of person about these issues. And like last sentence, but like the new Jim Crow is just full of this kind of BS. Like the reason that there are so many people in jail, in particular so many Blacks, is the misdemeanor drug laws. It's just claims that really aren't true that you can just unpack. Like for white and Black men, the most common thing that puts someone in state or federal prison is murder. Right. So I mean that it's just you can go blow by blow and point out this stuff's not true.
There were no police until after the Civil War.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I remember you brought this up on one of the podcasts. Yeah, the police were founded as slave catchers. No, I mean, of course, like the idea of a city watch goes back to whoever the king was in Babylon, Sargon. Like so, this has been going on for quite some time. Actual policing, to shout out to an expert in his field, goes back to Robert Peel in Britain,
like 1820s or something like that.
Yeah, the Bobbies then came across the ocean to Albany, New York, Boston. So in fact, there's a whole bunch of reality, and then there's sort of like the Black Anne Boleyn kind of nonsense that's used to counter it. And I think it's important to know this. But there are a lot of people that believe in the Black Anne Boleyn and think you're a bigot if you don't.
But it goes beyond that, though, Greg. Too, it goes from policing to race. Right. So when we talk about rewriting history, not telling the truth, you talk about touch on it a little bit in the book, but we've seen it, and I've seen it with my kid in school. We talk about it a lot. This push on there's a race problem. It's over exaggerated, but let's give them their argument and say that there is one. So we're going to fix it, but we're going to fix human nature, what hubris, but we're going to fix it by doing things like culturally relevant math and English, because those blacks can learn if you teach them the way they learn, right? Let's start beating on a drum and snapping our fingers, and then they'll get the math because they learn differently, right? You talk in the book about them using the cultural relevance as it pertains to discipline in school. So there's this racist belief coming in, what I call progressive racism, coming in and saying we need to fix the racism by bringing in this new level of racism, and they use flawed evidence to do it, and people buy into it.
So one of my recommendations in the book actually is that everybody, no matter what you look like, and I hate saying what you look like, and I mentioned that in the book, but everybody needs to become a bit more comfortable talking about race. Initially, when race comes up, it shuts up a good chunk of the people in the room, especially
I love that. I remember wait a minute, Greg. I got to go back. I remember you were kind enough to have me on your podcast, and you asked me what we should do, and I said that you're like, really, in this culture, you want everybody talking about it, and I was like, yes, everybody needs to talk about it, because otherwise, only the crazies are talking about it. I'm glad to see you agree with me now.
And the powerful, I mean, it's determined, the parameters are determined by the left.
Yep.
Generally white liberals, oh, by the way. And very important, wealthy, powerful people who want to retain their power, their status, will go along with some of the crazy stuff that's coming out from the left. And I think it's happening from a position of fear. Right. So yeah, and by the way, you might say the wrong thing, you might offend somebody, and cancel culture is very, very useful actually in dictating a very shallow conversation about race. But you have to take the plunge, because the people at Netflix can engage in all this stuff, but the trickle down effect, it's going to affect people who work at a bus depot. Yep. And it's going to affect, quite frankly, no matter what your color, but it's already affected me, and in a weird way, it's made me a bit more empathetic. And I know maybe people would roll their eyes at this, but, I went through a phase where I was trying to sell something in Hollywood, and, twice it was mentioned to me that my race was a problem.
Wow.
Not the flavor of the month. And
I thought they were supposed to do it without actually saying it. They actually said it.
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, it was said out loud. And one was a euphemistically flavor of the month. Right. Another one less so. Look, you're a white guy, and that is a pejorative. And look, I'm not proud to be white, but I'm not ashamed of it either. And I actually, though, the experience made me strangely anybody who's ever been judged over things they can't control, that really is painful. It's frustrating. You bring all these things to the table, but you're going to fixate on that, which I had nothing to do with. Yes, and I know we can talk about white privilege and all that stuff, but you know what? Everybody is struggling. Everybody's on edge. Everybody's just trying to make it. And I've got a lot of life left. That was a real pivotal moment, actually, for me when I went through that. I'm glad I went through that in retrospect, but it was tough. And by the way, other people have paid much, much, much bigger prices for how they look. I know that, but just focusing on myself, and that, quite frankly, is who I focus on most of the time. I think we all do each other. I mean, it was just a searing experience. But again, I'm glad I had it.
But we're in the culture where it's all about your truth, and you were able to tell your truth. So that's what's important. Now, you talk about the media earlier. So another important thing is, I look at, I try not to comment as much as you two do, but I scroll through what the hot topics are on social media. We got the Black Saint Augustine, and we got Clarence Thomas and Picasso. Oh my God, Picasso was a jerk. And surprisingly, Steven Crowder's divorce. Why do I care about that? So there's all these things that everyone has an opinion on social media. Greg, you're in the media. What should we be talking about that we're not talking about?
Oh, well, it's interesting. Tucker actually went through a couple of matters that don't get the attention they should. War and peace, energy, demographics. The biggest issues seem to get the least amount of attention. But I have been having that conversation on a daily basis for a long time. Hey, Newsmax, by the way, is a great place to work, and it's getting bigger right now because of what happened over there at Fox. But we're not as central on the dial, and we are we're just not as well established, although we're getting there. A lot of the things that Tucker's been talking about, I mean, I think we wage substantive conversations every day. Charles,
Every day at 10 p.m. Eastern on Newsmax, right?
10 p.m. exactly. Tucker said in that video again, like there are a few places you can go for the truth. There are not many, but there are some. So there's hope. And quite frankly, he was talking about my show. I know he was. When he unveiled the footage from January 6th that Kevin McCarthy gave him access to, 40,000 hours, and he revealed some really fascinating things. Number one, the horns guy was being facilitated by the cops. Officer Sicknick was alive when they told us he was dead. They totally maligned and misrepresented the activities of Josh Hawley that day.
Mm-hmm.
It was amazing what he found. He reported it on his show. And I said, this is the biggest thing in 20 years. So I went crazy with it. And it was pointed out by Media Matters that Greg Kelly and his show did 37 minutes on that story, which is more than all of Fox News combined outside of Tucker's show. I did more than all of Fox News combined on the biggest story in 20 years. I'm proud of that. So look, I think they're talking about the important things, but they're talking about it in a dishonest way, and not getting to the and now certain issues are totally off limits. January 6th, the election. Right. You can't. I will. People who are evil enough to cheat and steal an election are evil enough to say you can never, ever, ever question the results.
Right. Yeah, no, not enough people are talking about these silent COVID corrections. That's another thing people are talking about, that they're silently saying, well, we never said that. Oh, I always said a shutdown was bad. No one's really giving them grief. I don't know. Do you think people know that there's like thousands of people that have been killed the last few months in Ethiopia? Do people even know that? Will, do you think people know that? That there's like a genocide going on in Ethiopia?
Yeah, well, first of all, that's a good point. I don't think most people know that there are quite a few wars going on around the world right now, aside from Ukraine. A good buddy of mine from grad school is from the Sudan.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I mean, that entire country, like traditionally the war there has been between the black and Arab factions. Mm-hmm. And the black faction, I guess, won, and neither side really got much of anything, but years back and set up the country of South Sudan. Now there's a split in Arabic Northern Sudan, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, like the two sides are about to go to war, and that's going to be a bloody war. I mean, the USA is evacuating its embassies right now.
Is the mainstream media talking about how slow they were to help the Americans that were there?
No, I mean, the Americans are going to be abandoned just like the Americans were in Afghanistan. I mean, we have Sean Hannity kept this up for like a while, but I mean, you could do right now like day 500 behind enemy lines. I mean,
but I mean, like outside of Fox, are they talking about it, right? Like,
no.
Like if I turn on MSNBC, it'll just be race hate, right? No one would be talking.
Yeah, but nobody's really talking about it at this point. Like they're still there. That's the thing. But I mean, so yeah, there are a lot of these issues. The one thing that you guys were just talking about, actually, I think is pretty important, is the kind of change in the original story that happened with COVID, because something that's kind of key with the media is that this happens with almost all stories where kind of the conventional center left turns out to be wrong. Like the same thing happened with defunding the police, right? So like defunding the police was a New York Times back page editorial. Like it was called, yes, we mean literally abolish the police. You can just Google it. Mm-hmm. So today, when people bring this up with, for example, Joe Biden or anyone else who's on the Democratic leadership team, it's kind of like, well, no, nobody ever suggested that. It's absolutely crazy, ridiculous. And I mean, the pitch from Biden now, if anything, is that the Republicans are the anti-policing party because of January 6th. Like those are the insurrectionists. Those are the people that opposed law enforcement. So yeah, I think you're right on that, but I think that that's a broader thing. Like when you control whatever it is, 93% of the media, you can do this with pretty much any story. Like you can present a narrative for several years, and then you can turn around and just ignore the fact that narrative happened and tell the other story. And that's the classic line in 1984, right? Like we were never at war with East Asia. Like you just change exactly what was said within, X frame of time. So I think that's my answer. I think what we're not talking enough about right now is mass institutional control of knowledge.
Mm,
Like you can just make books disappear. You
right.
can go into Wikipedia and change, like the picture of St. Augustine was changed yesterday.
Right.
Like you can go into Wiki or Britannica and just change what knowledge is. Like I would encourage you guys to Google Berber, which is what the big man was,
Right.
and see what Berbers look like today, as opposed to what they looked like on the Wayback Machine a week ago. And they kind of transitioned in skin tone in terms of what Google's forwarding in the results. So there's a particular guy at maybe the VP level that's doing that, and I think that's one of the big stories of our time.
Yeah.
Buy hardcover books like what you have behind you. I mean, they
Oh yeah.
exist. They're physical. What they can do with knowledge, and only a few companies, only a handful of individuals have their hands on everything. It's buy physical books. Can I ask you real quick though, both of you, what do you think the reason is for the lack of coverage of what's happening in Ethiopia, the minimal coverage that's happening in Sudan? I would submit that it's the third world. You don't hear that very often, and basically so much of Africa has been consumed by civil war and factionalism, and it's been and yes, I mean, are we more closely aligned culturally to Europe than Africa?
Right.
But I think the knee-jerk reaction is, well, there must be a bigoted component to our lack of concern. And I don't believe that's true, but it is a little awkward.
Well,
What do you think,
I
Charles?
don't think it'd be hard to say it's bigoted because the black journalists are also not talking about it.
Well, I mean that's
Our
a good
culture,
point,
though.
and
Go ahead.
no, but I mean, so first of all, I think that's a fairly fair point. Like, there's a famous study of bank lending that found that there is some, not much, discrimination against Black and Hispanic house buyers. And for a long time, I was kind of persuaded by that, even though it doesn't make a lot of sense that a bank that's trying to make money wouldn't loan to a Black businessman who wants to buy a house. But a friend of mine who's Nigerian, actually, is a Black guy, said at one point, like 9-10% of the banks in this country are owned by Blacks and Latinos. Like, where do they make their loans? And like, if you look at it, it's exactly the same. It's the same quote unquote pattern of discrimination. Asians, have higher loan acceptance rates than whites, so on. So that's an interesting point. Like, if you were to look at BET or the Defender or any major collection of Black journalists, National Association of Black Journalists, are they covering Africa? That's actually interesting. But I mean, my honest answer would be racism might play some small percentage role. I think the actual answer is mostly just laziness more than anything else. Like, I live in Appalachia right now, not like Appalachia. I mean, I've lived in, downtown Frankfurt and Louisville, not on the side of a mountain or anything, although I love that region of the country. But one of the things that's discussed in Kentucky is that although it's a great state, there also are some real pathologies here. Like, for everything except murder, the crime rate in many poor white areas, certainly the deaths to despair rate, is on par with a lot of inner city regions. And many people feel justly ignored. Like, there's not a lot of money going in. There aren't a lot of telethons. I don't mean to be glib about it, but why does no one seem to care? An honest answer would be there aren't a lot of cameras in, say, Harlan County.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in New York City or even Chicago, even Louisville, it's very easy to go down to the hood and get some footage, get some cut. It's very hard to go to West Virginia and do the same. Similarly, I mean, there are far more news bureau cameras in Europe. I mean, even in Kyiv, even in Moscow, but then there are in Addis Ababa. And I think you certainly see that effect. I mean, violence in South Africa, for example, would be very extensively covered. So would violence in Cairo. So I don't think racism is the primary factor. I think the further something is away, the more distant it's seen as being from the West, the more you have to rely on sort of stringers on the ground, the more you have to expend money, maybe hire some local guns, the less likely you are to cover that. A great deal of journalism, and Greg, I want to hear whether you agree with this as a journalist, but a great deal of journalism to me now, as someone who admired the profession a great deal in the Mike Royko days, strikes me as more PR. I mean, people kind of scrolling through Twitter and sort of seeing what the issues are and doing this stuff like emailing the damn politicians to get their take. It's the easy approach. You're not really putting on the gumshoes and going out there. And the people that do that, James O'Keefe, for example, I've met a couple of times, definitely edgy guy, but actually gets out there and does that. Those guys tend to be almost cast out of the fraternity. So I think that's the answer. It's hard to get on the ground in Ethiopia and look at what's going on. It's pretty easy to go look at white versus Muslim violence in France, or even to go look at the Ukraine war. So that's a big part of it to me.
Totally. I actually call myself these days a talk show host. Journalism means different things to different people,
Yeah.
and but you're right. It's the ease of sitting back. We can have the world at our fingertips, and it is so easy that way to for the truth to be lost. I actually have this theory that we got into the Iraq War in part because analysts were looking at reports about reports about reports about reports that somebody made, who interviewed two people, Curveball and the other guy in Jordan, and there was way too much room for distortion, a game of telephone. And if you don't have that face-to-face granular, understanding, well, you're going to make mistakes, and policies will be laws will be passed that shouldn't be passed. I mean, journalism is no longer, and that was the fun of it, quite frankly. Going somewhere, not knowing the answers. I saw an interview, I think it was Maggie Haberman. I mean, she did not ask one question. Like, it used to be a journalist, you didn't have to know anything. You didn't know some things, basic, but you were really in discovery mode, curiosity. A curious people could thrive as journalists because they, and that is gone. Everybody is worried about branding, and and everybody wants to hear their own stories, and journalists are struggling for. I think Woodward and Bernstein, quite frankly, we're still living with their aftermath. I mean, you can make it big you can make millions of dollars. You can make millions of dollars if you play it right, and it's such a shame. The truth is, it's all about marketing. You said PR and marketing. People just trying to become influencers. They want to be, which is like the old way of saying, I want to be famous. That seems to be the objective. Not learning, not listening, and what a shame.
Well, I think we're all brilliant, and it's a part of all of those three. But I got one more component to think. I think there's an elitism to it. So you talked about, Greg, about what I don't want to say it's racism, but it's a third world. We're culturally more aligned with Europe than there, which is true. And maybe that's part of it. So I'm looking at it. I wanted to bring this up. So there was a debate, a couple of people debating on Twitter about pledging allegiance to the flag. And someone replied to it saying, in all my years of being in school as a student and being a teacher, I have never once witnessed anyone pledging allegiance to a flag. Maybe some schools in the South, here's the key part, but certainly not mainstream America. You see that there? So what they're saying is that's different America. That's not the real America, right? So of course, how can they cover what's going on in Ethiopia? They don't even count where Will is as real America. So you factor in the PR part, making too much money part, and all these other pieces, but add on the fact that we all are these elitists in these big cities, and we think the same three stories are important. So we only talk about those three stories. There's only a finite amount of time. We got a 1 hour show. We pick 4 topics, and we're not going to pick those topics. So we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the things that sizzle, right? It's like someone says, well, they keep talking about mayor. I don't know if you saw this in Chicago. I'll end on this. So Will alluded to Brandon Johnson's terrible response to the kids and the mayhem in the streets, which is true. So a couple weekends later, they say it was several hundred, I don't know how many, but a bunch of pastors and adults marched to the streets. So then it became a debate on Twitter. It's like, see, why doesn't the media cover that? All you people on the right, then it became an attack on the right. You all say that no one in Chicago cares about the crime. Look at these men marching, and it didn't cover, it didn't make the media this, that, or the other. Well, one, how much of a difference do you think it's going to make realistically when 30 people are being shot every week because some guys walk down the street? You're forgetting that there's a pathology to what's going on, and the people who are the shooters aren't paying attention to who's walking down the street. But beyond that, the reason it didn't get massive coverage is because that's not what they found interesting. It didn't sizzle. A couple hundred people walking down the street is not the same as a video, the visceral video of a 13-year-old kid jumping up and down on a bus. Right. So if you can only show one video, CNN, Fox News, whomever. It's not even left, right. At this point, it doesn't even matter. You can only show one video. You're going to show the guy jumping on the car. You're not going to show people walking down the street. There's nothing that's going to draw people to you. And that is another factor to it. Gentlemen.
Very much so. Very much so. But look, I mean, like, we're not looking to television shows to solve all of our problems, right?
Of course not.
I mean, you know, it is TV. You know, it is a newspaper. I mean, there are a lot of other ways to tackle these issues. I mean, a big part of what I do, quite frankly, is companionship. And yes, there's an entertainment component to this. A lot of people go into journalism, say they want to change the world. That was not me, although now I do. But I think that's a bias in and of itself, because you assume that there must be something wrong and I've got to fix it. And for most of my career, I certainly did not hold that view. I'm not qualified to fix it.
Right.
You gentlemen on the other side, you could.
Well, that's why we have to get more people, like you said, to talk about these issues. So tell the people where they can find you. We know about the TV show. You also do radio and all that other stuff. So give us all the places we can find more Greg Kelly.
Thank you very much. Newsmax, 10 p.m., although Newsmax.com has it all. And I do have a radio show on WABC in New York, and at Greg Kelly USA on Twitter. At Greg Kelly USA on Twitter. And many thanks, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Professor Charles, great to see you.
Greg, thanks for joining us.
Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save because I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.